Hello again, 12A. I'm just waiting on some information or some documents from GAC about referencing. And when I've got that, then I can share that. Unfortunately, all of my materials are back at my apartment and I'm currently in Albany, Western Australia. I don't want to give you referencing details that's not aligned with the GAC requirements. And there's lots of different ways that you can reference, so I just want to make sure that I'm providing you with the correct information. I've looked at some of your drafts and unfortunately a couple of you have just copied and pasted the website without having the author details, don't have the date that you accessed it, don't have the name of the article. When you're doing your research, or now that you have done your research, and to be honest, all you actually have to do if you haven't changed your research is go into your annotated bibliography and get the reference from there. So and I know that you only did 4, but that is actually the style and the structure. I will do a mini video if I'm not back, if we're not back face to face, and give you a little bit more detail about referencing. But today I wanted to talk to you about editing. I've had a look at some guides, one from Harvard University and the other one from the other good university, I can't remember. They're from Oxford, there you go. One from Harvard and one from Oxford. So you're getting a high level of information about the reference, about editing. So I would like to go through those with you. Just bear with me a moment. Right, okay, so the first one, you need to ask yourself these very basic questions, and then I'm going to go into some really specific detail. I've actually got 2 documents that I wanted to go through with you. We won't read through everything, but some of these tips are actually really, really useful. And as I said, I want to make sure that you're giving a high level essay, and to be honest, doing the editing is that final polish. So that's the difference between getting, 65 or 75 to 85%. And I know that you're probably exhausted after writing your essay and that you don't want to read over it again, but I promise you it makes all of the difference. That's the reason there's a job called the editor, and they actually get paid really good money to do what they're doing. The things that make a good editor is having a high level of attention to detail, not having an emotional attachment to the literature. So I mentioned before with my thesis that I wanted to say that, we should all hold hands and hug each other and the world will be a better place. But unfortunately, the result of my research was very, very different to that. So unfortunately, when I was with my lecturer and he was editing, he was cutting out a lot of the things that I loved the absolute most. So in a word, you need to be ruthless. Okay, so you need to be ruthless. Just because you think that's, oh, I love that sentence, I wrote that sentence really beautifully, it doesn't fit in with the rest of your essay, you're going to have to let it go. So firstly, have I answered the question as directly and comprehensively as possible? Many of you, when you wrote your plans and sent them in to me, got very distracted with the question. So rather than talking about surrogacy and impoverished women, you were talking just about surrogacy, talking about animal rights and science, rather than talking about whether animal testing should be stopped. Maybe talking about teenagers and punishment, you're talking about why teenagers might commit a crime, which is not the point of the essay. So make sure as a first point is that you go back, have I answered the question as directly and comprehensively as possible? That means it's not wishy-washy and it's not waffly. Does the argument make sense? Does my argument make sense? You don't want to have a Trump-based argument that makes no sense and that has no research or substance behind it. So when I say that, I'm talking about, is it well-balanced and well-researched? When I say well-balanced, I'm sure that you all, sorry, I'm moving the chair. When I say well-balanced, you'll understand that I mean that you have considered every angle, that you've looked at it from different perspectives, from an economical perspective, from a sociological, psychological, political, environmental, what have you. And have you looked at it from both angles? Now, it means that have you looked insightfully and I mean insightfully, from the opposing view. So I'm very much against animal testing, 100%, but if I was writing an essay, I would need to concede that without it, we probably wouldn't have the technological, the medicinal developments that we have had probably in the last 50 years or so. So even though it's against my opinion and it's against what my essay is really about, I still need to acknowledge it in order to oppose it. And well-researched. The proof is in the pudding. The reference sheet is one thing, okay? But I'm not going to say, well, it's well-researched because you've put 25 references on your reference sheet. I'm not an idiot, and I know that clever little trick where you just jump on, grab a whole heap of websites that look like they'd be relevant and then pop them on that document. It's an old game that many of us have played before. I know that it's well researched by having a look at in-text quotes, having a look at information that's paraphrased, and having a look at people that have referred according to the journal of da-da-da, in according to da-da-da, the United Nations states that. So these are not necessarily quotes, but you're referring directly to research, okay? So well-balanced and well-researched. Is the evidence relevant to and supportive of my argument, okay? So you want to make sure if you're trying to say that global warming doesn't exist, you don't want to have a whole heap of statistics proving that the icebergs are melting, the water level is rising, and we have a big hole in the ozone layer. That's not going to support your argument. So you need to make sure that what I'm saying, is it supporting my thesis statement? Okay, is it relevant as well? So don't get distracted. I know that someone is writing about migrants. You don't get distracted about what people perceive migrants to be like. That doesn't help your argument. If you want to say that migrants are actually beneficial to a host country, you don't want to spend all of your time, while you can acknowledge it, don't spend all of your time explaining why migrants are horrible, dirty vermin, which we know that Trump is doing in his diatribes. That is not academic, and it's also probably fallacy and likely to be opinion-based. So your evidence must be that evidence, not something that you've watched on Facebook, not something that you've looked at on Twitter, not something that your parents told you, okay? Have I used consistent referencing style? If you're doing in-text referencing, there's a few ways that you can do it. And as I said, we'll talk about that once I've got the document from the GAC group. But what you're really looking at, is that, for instance, if you're doing in-text referencing and you're going to use quotes and then use a footnote, which is when you put maybe a little number 1 near the quote and it goes down to the bottom of the page and it puts it there, but then it also connects through with your reference page. I'm not sure if you've done that during your computing class with Mayuri, but I'm happy to show you that as well. That's how we used to do it when I was at university, but I'm sure things have changed. Another way that you can do is to put the surname of the writer, comma, and the date of publication, and you put those in brackets at the end of the quote. So it's another way of in-text referencing. But what you need to do is make sure that you're using the same style across the entire essay. Don't use a footnote for one and then in-text referencing for another, and make sure when you do your reference sheet that all of those references are also consistent. If there are any special instructions or guidelines, have I followed them? So for instance, if you're doing a scientific report, they might ask for recommendations, so make sure that you've included that as well. This isn't necessarily relevant for us, but probably at university you're likely to get some special instructions and guidelines as well. Okay, so what we're moving forward now, I've told you this a good few times and I stand by it. This is not for English as a second language. This is for anyone that is editing anything ever. So even if you're writing a poem or a song or a story in Chinese, you should definitely read it out loud because you'll pick up things that you don't necessarily know. So when we labour, again, this is written, it must be in the American Harvard University, because it should have a U in it. Over sentences, we can sometimes lose sight of the larger picture. So what happens is that we're reading what we think we've written if we don't read it aloud. If we read it aloud, we can hear it. And you can hear when you're missing a comma. You can hear when the sentence doesn't quite make sense or the rhythm is slightly wrong. You can hear when it sounds a bit clunky or if the sentence is too long, okay? So read it out loud. I promise you this will work. I do this with my work all of the time. If I'm doing a presentation, if I'm writing a poem, a story, anything, I always read it out to myself. It's a bit uncomfortable at first, but you definitely do get used to it. And trust me, I've now made 17 pre-recorded lessons and I've gotten very used to my own voice. Okay. Make sure all of your words are doing important work in making your argument. You don't need to just put in words for the sake of it. We don't need, it's what we call waffling, when you take a long time to say anything. It's generally what politicians will do when they don't want to answer a question. So are all of your words and phrases necessary? Necessary. Or are they just taking up space? Are you thinking, oh, I've got a 1,000-word essay to write, oh, I'll just chuck this in there? It will take away from the purpose of your essay, and it will definitely take away from your argument as well, okay? Are your sentences tight and sharp or loose and dull, okay? Yeah, for instance, if you used 14 words to get across the point and you're like, oh, actually, I could make that really simple. So I say short, sharp, and straight to the point. Also, I like this here, this is quite good for your vocabulary. So instead of saying something says something, use higher level vocabulary. And the best way you can do that is get your English thesaurus out next to you. I used to use this all the time. In fact, I still use the thesaurus quite regularly when I'm blogging, just to get some different words and high level words that I might not generally use in speaking. So using words like argues, acknowledges, contends, believes, reveals, suggests, or claims, they make it more lively and interesting, and also it gives you sort of that feeling that, yes, this is an academic essay and this is someone that I really want to listen to. You need to make sure that you're finding the precise and specific language, okay? So if you're talking about animal rights, if you're talking about migrants within host countries, make sure that you're looking at the appropriate information or the appropriate words. So they've given an example of the evils of society drain our resources. The word evils could mean anything. We have no idea what that is. So it's not specific enough, and it wouldn't be academic enough. Okay, so you don't want to make too overly generalized statements. I don't tend to get this with you guys, but I used to do it quite a lot. I'd use language that made me sound like a very pompous up myself something. Some of this, in actual fact, it's thoroughly important that everybody speak proper King's English and do not use jargon or words such as like from America. So it doesn't make you sound like a very nice person, and you might think it sounds really impressive, but when you read it out, just read it out and see how it actually would sound to someone else. So your tone can affect whether someone actually enjoys or continues to read your work or decides not to, because they get a sense of who you are through your writing. So you want to make sure that you're not putting them off by using inappropriate language that makes it feel like maybe you're a little bit better than them. So just be careful of that. And I've just mentioned earlier, be tough on your most dazzling sentences. So my favourite sentences, my lecturer, he crossed them out in this terrible red pen, and I still have that image in my mind because those were really, really important sentences to me, and I thought they were very poetic and very beautiful, and he said they were completely irrelevant, and also I was 500-600 words over my thesis. So if you're editing down, and like I said before, don't worry about your word count when you're doing your first couple of drafts. Word count comes into when you're doing your strong final edits, and every time you edit, your word count's probably coming down a little bit. I always recommend about 2 to 3 drafts every academic essay that you do, and that's going through all of these techniques and processes every single time you do it. Okay, so that's just from the Harvard. I just want to jump across and see if there's some other things that I missed. There were some other things that... okay, so first they're talking about getting the structure right. And Fortunately, we went through your plan in quite a lot of detail, and using that plan is going to ensure that you get the structure right. However, when you finish your essay, have a look at it and think, maybe paragraph 3 would actually be better as paragraph 1, and I can move 1 down to 2 and so on and so forth. Have a look at your structure. Is it the best way to deliver your argument? For instance, I always like to put my opposing arguments at the beginning, and I like to put where I want the essay to go, so my opinion, in third person at the end. Okay, so because I think that the end is really where you get your pump. But some people like to put their argument first and then put the opposing argument, and in the conclusion restate theirs. So you've got to look at what's best for your essay and for your particular argument as well. Pruning. I'm sure you guys know what pruning is. So when you've got a big tree or a big bush, you've got to cut it down to size, and that's the same as editing. So this is that word count business. So a great thing to do, a really easy one, do you have super long sentences? Like I said before, if you've got 14 words, you can say it in 5, cut that down. Is it short, sharp, and straight to the point? Or is it a really long sentence and a little bit waffly? Or is it a completely unnecessary sentence? Have you repeated yourself too many times? Repetition is a really common issue that we get, especially in a paragraph. Often people will say the same thing 2 or 3 times to make that main point in the paragraph, rather than using different types of evidence, anecdotes and examples to prove that point. So you need to make sure you've got that diversity. Have a look at the size of your paragraphs. If you have a paragraph that lasts for an entire page, we have a big problem, okay? So that's a nice easy way. Am I using one main idea? Should this be broken up into 2 paragraphs, or should I get a good chunk of that paragraph out? So it helps to trim it down to size. We've talked about overcomplicated, so don't try and sound too posh. Be careful of that. For you guys, you need to be very careful of connotations. So we've talked about that a couple of times in these pre-recorded classes. A lot of the words that you might use, especially guys, if you use a translator, it has a different connotation in English. And that's why I always recommend not using a translator, but thinking of a simple word in English and then using either an English dictionary or a thesaurus to get the correct word. Use a translator, you might get something that's really actually quite offensive, because our words obviously have many different connotations. So the meaning of our words, and probably the same as in Chinese, actually have evolved over time. So once when the word gay just meant happy, it now has a reference or a connotation to homosexuality, which might take away from the meaning of your particular essay. I've just mentioned that repetition of ideas is one thing, but also repetition of words. So don't keep using the same words. It becomes boring, monotonous, and it will aggravate the reader. So when you're writing your essay, don't just think about you as the writer. You need to think about your reader and how you're going to keep them engaged, and most importantly, how you're going to impress your teacher so that you can get a really high mark, okay? So again, get that thesaurus out and have a look at different words that you can use to express the same meaning or the same idea. Use different ways of structuring your sentence. Rather than always putting the main part at the subject at the beginning and the verb at the end, swap it up, put the verb at the beginning and the subject at the end. Okay? Use semicolons rather than just commas all of the time. Use brackets if you're trying to emphasize a particular point. However, do not use exclamation points. You should never ever use an exclamation point when you're writing an academic essay. Spell check. First of all, yes, do use spell check. Second of all, and I didn't say this, use Grammarly. Grammarly is free and it's really good, but I didn't say that. So when you're spell checking, make sure that you double check. So you can see here they've had the example of the word from, but it typed as form. It's still a word and they might not pick it up. So again, the way that you're going to get that is by reading out loud, okay? Just make sure that you keep reading out loud. Typing mistakes, these are just such simple errors that show lack of care. And you might have spent hours and hours and hours working on your essay, but you decided not to read aloud and you decided not to really edit it. You thought, I've written my last concluding sentence, that's it, I don't have to do any more, woohoo! Big problem. if I come up and I see that there's lots of spelling errors, that there's lots of typing errors, that it doesn't look the right way, that you haven't aligned everything, that you haven't used 1.5, that you haven't given me a cover sheet, that you've got one font here and another font there, you've got one size here and another size there, that you've got something bold and then something not bold. All of these things are going to really take away from your essay. So when you're reading it out loud, I definitely suggest that you get yourself a red pen, you print your essay off, and you physically, obviously Terry will disagree with that, but he's not the English teacher, I am, so listen to me. So you want to get your red pen out, read it aloud, and make the changes. Get back onto your computer, fix those changes up, print it, leave it for a day, come back, read it out loud with a red pen, and see what other changes you've got, okay? We don't need to worry about that. Commas, consistent spelling, that's fine. Quotations, we've talked about the importance of doing that, and consistent formatting. So formatting is really important. I know it might seem like it's not, but it definitely is. Rebecca actually put in the group, in the WeChat group, the GAC example. So I'd highly recommend that you jump on and you have a look at that to make sure that you're submitting that. I will be giving you, part of your mark will be based on what your formatting looks like. Okay, so that is editing for today. So as I said, that you want to do 2 to 3 drafts per essay, go through all of these tips and tricks. I hope that you wrote some notes today from everything I've talked about. If not, obviously this is recorded, so you can always go back. Thank you for your time. As always, please get in contact with me via WeChat or email. I'll get back to you as quickly as I possibly can. And thank you very much for your ongoing work. I hope to see you in the classroom very soon.